Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Elaine Ng, and I'm editor and publisher of ArtAsiaPacific magazine. Today, we're at Sotheby's, where they're just about to open their preview for their spring sales here in Hong Kong. I'm going to take you around to look at some of the incredible works that they have on offer. And first, we're going to meet with Nicolas Chow, chairman of Sotheby's Asia.
Welcome, Elaine.
Hi, Nicholas.
Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me. So, there are these really stunning, incredible works of art from across geographies and time periods. What's going on here?
So this is our icon cell. It's a very tightly curated cell of 5 works spanning 1,000 years and sort of exploring, each work here explores the human form. And so I thought I'd show you first this extraordinary bodhisattva, which is a majestic legacy of the Song dynasty.
Wow, it's really stunning. I would expect to see something like this in one of the top international museums with a first-rate collection of Chinese art. Is there anything comparable in one of those museums?
In fact, these sort of large sort of life-size or over life-size figures of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, which is the god of compassion and mercy, you'll find them in some of the most defining museums around the world as anchor pieces of the Asian collection. For example, in the Metropolitan Museum, in the British Museum, in the Victoria and Albert Museum, you'll find similar pieces right there, center stage.
Yeah, I feel like I've definitely seen something like this before.
Yeah, I mean, these are absolutely spectacular, and you see the dynamic form. The Bodhisattva is seated in a pose of royal ease, which is the most sensual and elegant of all poses in the Buddhist iconography.
What I love most about this Bodhisattva is the way his robe, drapes his body, and you can still see the contour of his figure. And what I'm especially drawn to is his belly. I mean, it's so natural and realistic in its rendering.
Exactly, that's where the tension and the energy of the sculpture is articulated. It's really in the tummy, and I think, generally speaking, when you look at Buddhist sculpture, it's a great place to start to judge quality and authenticity. The other monumental piece that we have in this cell is this extraordinary painting by Zhang, one of the finest and largest to come to the market in recent years.
Wow. I know anytime you encounter an ink painting with these very sensuous, saturated colors of vibrant blues, turquoises, these emerald greens, you're standing in front of a Zhang Daqian.
Exactly.
The painting is massive. It's
a massive painting. It's probably the largest portrait he's done, among his largest in his lifetime.
Who is the portrait of?
This is a self-portrait. It's actually Zhang Daqian himself with his favorite Tibetan Mastiff, who was called Black Tiger. And it's quite unusual insofar as it's actually a splash self-portrait. We know, of a few dozen self-portraits that he painted throughout his life, from when he was 28 years old onwards. But that's the only one that is splashed in that really trademark sort of style. So it dates probably to 1967 or 1968, which is the peak period when he experimented with this style.
How common is it to see self-portraiture in traditional Chinese art?
It's pretty rare. Very few artists, ink artists, have actually taken on the subject. And this subject that was very, very dear to him, and very possibly because he was well versed in art history, had a lot of friends in Europe, and he had this exposure.
You said this was painted in the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
So this would basically, by this time, he is essentially the Picasso at the time in the Chinese world. So it would make total sense, right? He was exhibiting internationally in museums around the world.
Absolutely.
He was well traveled. He had homes in multiple places around the world. So would you say that these outside influences, these encounters, these ideas led him to push more self-portraiture?
Definitely totally uncommon for a Chinese painter. Exactly.
Fascinating. It's beautiful. It really is. With his favorite dog, did you say?
That's his favorite dog that he had when he lived in Chengdu. By the time he paints this portrait, the dog is long gone, but he makes him reappear in paintings.
So tender. Thank you, Nicholas, for introducing this special theme sale and, of course, sharing your insights. I know that you have some other things that you're really excited about. Yeah. So we will meet again soon at the Chinese Works of Art.
I'll see you a bit later.
Thank
you,
Elaine.
Thank you.
So speaking of Picasso, here we have a Picasso, and we will be talking to Felix Kwok, who heads modern art for Sotheby's.
Hi, Elaine.
Hello. So you're going to introduce some of the other important figurative works in the icon sale.
Yeah, in this icon sale, we are very honored to present this Buste de Matador, which is a very iconic subject matter of Picasso all over his career.
Yeah. So I would say that this is, probably the most revered of all of Picasso's subject matter, the portrait, right?
Well, I would say this is the most iconic painting by Picasso, especially in his post-war period of his career.
Yeah, this is it's definitely post-war. You can tell it's very loosely painted, a kind of pastiche of all his previous styles. Some art historians say that all of Picasso's portraits were in fact self-portraits of the artist himself. What do you think about that?
Well, definitely. Picasso, when he paints portraits, I think he has a lot of personal sentiment on the person or on the figure that he paints, especially on a matador. It represents the glory of his motherland, Spain. He is always interested in painting bullfightings and matador all over his life. And in 1970s, when he came to the final stage of his life, bullfighting and matador, the image really reminds him the glory of his country and also the energy and the debates of life and death really gives him a lot of energy to struggle against his destiny, especially on life and aging.
Yeah, I was going to say that, bullfighting was a theme that, basically ran through the entire body of work in his entire career, including a painting that he made when he was 8 years old. So I was going to ask you, why do you think he returned to this subject matter so late in his life? What did bullfighting symbolize to Picasso?
Well, in fact, Picasso painted this painting after he saw the final bullfight in his life together with his wife, Jacqueline. So this painting actually comes from the image of a Mozambique matador that he saw in the final bullfight. And you can see the color is very unusual. The appearance of this matador, it's very different, very bright color, orange hair, blue in general tone with a very sharp sword next to the body. I believe that this is a very fresh image which really impressed him in this final bullfighting. And it also, the energy and the power of this matador really gave him a lot of motivation to create. In fact, in 1972, this painting took part in his very final solo exhibition, which really shocked the media because by that time people thought Picasso is already old-fashioned. But this solo exhibition in Avignon, the Palace of Pope, really impressed the people, and people are very surprised that Picasso is young again. So this painting took part in the show and really represented the very final, very strong energy in the final stage of his artist career.
Yeah, it makes sense that it would be exhibited in this important exhibition, since Matador also a very important subject matter. And I know that many Chinese artists they admired Picasso, artists like Sanyu and Zhang. I wanted to ask you, what do you think, what made these artists admire Picasso so much? I mean, regardless of that he was the most exhibited artist at the time.
Well, when Chinese or Asian artists going through the modernization of their traditional art, they took a lot of references from the West. And Picasso is definitely one of the most inspiring artists to them in terms of how Picasso changed the way of seeing the world and how to express himself. So this is very inspiring to the Asian artists who has a very long and great artistic tradition in their own civilization. But Picasso gave them totally new way of expressing the artist himself. So Lin Fengmian, Zhang Daqian, many of these early Chinese modern pioneers took Picasso as a very important reference. on their artistic progression. And also Sanyu, who has arrived in Paris in 1960, probably has known Picasso as early as in the 1920s or 1930s, because they have a very important common friend, Henri Pierre-Roche.
Right.
So in 1942, Sanyu even wrote an article on the Paris newspaper as a reflection of a Chinese artist on Picasso.
Right. Speaking of Sanyu, another, great artist who basically incorporated the traditions of Chinese calligraphy with Western art motifs, and who was deeply inspired by Picasso. He also challenged the status quo in academic art. Here we have this beautiful Sanyu, this very kind of intimate painting of, this languid female nude lying on her stomach, being lovingly adored by this small Pekingese dog. I know for Sanyu, when he paints animals, they often tend to symbolize some kind of emotion. I know maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you sold this this painting, 2 Pekingese on a chair, and I know those dogs symbolized, of course, companionship, love, but also a kind of longing for home. What emotion do you think is being symbolized in this particular painting?
Well, Sanyu, when Sanyu paints nudes and other paintings, there's always some sort of symbolism hidden in the painting. So when he paints nudes, in some paintings we could refer to some of his lovers in his life, and in this painting, there's a conversation between the two figures, the nude and the little dog. Well, this is a very rare painting of Sanyu, because this is not only just a nude not a nude painting, but it also consists of a little animal, which is another very important subject matter. So the nude and the dog created a very intimate conversation, because the nude is apparently lying on the carpet and hiding herself in her bent arms, and this is totally out of protection body language. And the little dog, it's a symbol of protection, guardian spirit, which is looking after the reclining nude when she's asleep. So this is a very intimate conversation, and it may remind us of his later relationship of the artist. After post-war life, he's alone, far away from home, and he's looking for love and protection for himself and to his lover. So on this painting, we actually could read a lot of messages in the later part of his life.
Yeah, it's very tender, the kind of dynamic between the dog and the woman. It's also unusual. Is it unusual to see the figure and an animal? Because I generally remember there's usually a figure on a canvas, or a still life on a single canvas, or animals in a canvas. Is it common to see this kind of composition, figure and animal?
You rarely see it. There are only 3 paintings which comprises nudes and a little dog, out of Sanyu's around 300 paintings. So this is very rare. And in addition, apart from the nude and the dog, we also need to pay attention on the composition.
Yes.
Because though Sanyu has committed himself in figurative painting in his whole artistic career, it doesn't mean that he wasn't influenced by abstract painting. Especially after the 1940s, he spent around 3 years in New York and returned to Paris. And apparently he is influenced by the abstraction spirit, and he incorporates some of this element into this painting. So say on the background, if we look at the pre-war period Sanyu's painting, it's usually more figurative, with some perspective, or maybe with a carpet, with embroideries. But factually speaking, this is purely abstraction.
Yes,
so
the
we can
background
see,
is very kind of flattened in these 3 kind of horizontal, distinct planes. And oftentimes people call him the Matisse of the Chinese world. In a way, it feels like a kind of each of these individual parts are like cutouts, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I wonder, is that a reference to something that he saw happening in Europe, or maybe the US, or something referencing back to Chinese, in terms of perspective, Chinese landscape painting?
Well, if we talk about the color of white, it's definitely referring to the Chinese aesthetic concept of liu bai, the concept of void. And when we talk about his career in 1940s, because he spent some time in America, so apparently he's also influenced by abstract expressionism, which arose in America in the 1940s. So very likely we could say that he might be inspired by abstract masters such as Mark Rothko.
Of course.
And also when we talk about another very important painting later that we'll see, the Zao Wou-Ki painting, you will see the background actually echoes between this Sanyu and the Zao Wou-Ki.
Should we take a look?
Yeah, sure.
So now we're going to be looking at...
The very important Zao Wou-Ki.
Yes. Of course, another great master who incorporates this cross-cultural pollination of East and West, right?
Definitely. When we look at the background, you will see 1960s, 1950s. Sanyu and Zao Wou-Ki met a lot, and they became very close in Paris. So you can see, artistically speaking, their artistic language, apart from the figurative and abstraction difference, you can see the background, the color, or the contrast, or the artistic concept they applied on the painting are very similar.
It's true, you can see echoes of that Sanyu painting with this particular painting. And similar to Sanyu's painting, but obviously in a very different way, this painting is so full of emotion.
Yes, definitely. This is probably the most powerful painting that I have seen in Zao Wou-Ki's 1960s. Artistically, we call it the Hurricane period, which is the most powerful period and the very successful career period in Zao Wou-Ki's life.
Yeah, so it has kind of all the kind of trademarks of a very important Zao Wou-Ki painting. When did he create this painting?
Well, this painting is created on the 13th February of 1962, which is exactly the date of his 42nd birthday.
Oh, wow, his birthday. Are there many paintings that were created that he finished on his birthday?
Well, according to Zao Wou-Ki's document, this is the first documented painting which is completed on the day of his birthday. So this is very rare and very important. And maybe also because of this, this is the only painting that I've seen which applies a very strong and powerful red on the entire painting.
Yeah, the red is so powerful. It carries so much emotion. Do you know what that might be referring to?
Well, red in Chinese definition always represents auspiciousness, love, passion, always bears a very good meaning, symbolism to people. And it is believed that Zao Wou-Ki created this painting on his birthday. That's why he used a very strong red, which is rarely seen in his hurricane
as a kind
period.
of celebration.
Yes, exactly.
Auspiciousness. Yeah. And we know that Zao Wou-Ki moved to Paris in 1948. Of course, it was the center of the art world at the time. And later he traveled to New York with Pierre Solange, where he encountered American abstract expressionism. To what degree do you think this exposure to European and American art had on his creative practice?
Well, the inspiration of the European art scene and American art scene are equivalently important to Zao Wou-Ki, especially in 1950s and 1960s. When we talk about 1950s, Zao Wou-Ki is more influenced by the French art scene when he spent more time in Paris, when his paintings getting more romantic. But in 1957, when he moved to New York for several years, the American expressionism is actually giving him a very different impact because the American painting tends to be more harsh, tends to be more powerful. Also, the American artist tends to paint on larger canvas, which definitely changed his way of painting. So in this painting, Zao Wou-Ki definitely tried to push his limit on using bigger canvas. And on the larger canvas, he's more expressively applying his passion and with the use of brushworks
Yes.
and very bold color and energy to represent his status in the 1960s.
Thank you so much, Felix, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I learned so much about Zao Wou-Ki and Sanyu and, of course, Picasso. Now we're going to talk about another great abstract painter by going over to the contemporary department, where we will speak with Yuki Terase. So,
Hi, Elaine.
Yuki.
How
Great
are
to
you?
see you?
Good to see you too.
So from one great abstract expressionist, Zao Wou-Ki, to another, this personally has been the painting that I'm most excited to see.
Oh, thank you.
This very rarely seen Clyfford still. Of course, he was one of the first generation of American abstract expressionists.
Yes, exactly.
Also associated with the color field painters. A peer contemporary of Mark Rothko, who introduced de Kooning. He introduced, Mark Rothko introduced Clyfford Still to Peggy Guggenheim, who gave him his first solo show at her gallery in 1946. And of course, he's notoriously known for, by 1951, severing all ties with his commercial galleries and also some of his peers.
Yes.
And dramatically declaring that he would only ever show in museum institutions.
Yes.
So Yuki, how rare and amazing is it to have a piece like this at auction?
It's such an honor to be offering this piece in Hong Kong, Elaine. I mean, precisely what you've described him is what Clyfford Still is about. He's one of the most important figures of abstract expressionism in America, but he was notoriously uncompromising, and he was also probably difficult to work with in terms of not wanting to sell his paintings. He's only had one show, commercial show, in 1969 that allowed the gallery to sell his painting, and this painting is from that show. So it's super rare to come across his works, and there are only probably 30 to 40 paintings in private circulation. 95% of his works produced are in Clyfford Still Museum in Denver. So it's extremely rare, even global scale, to come across his painting, and it's a fresh to the market piece. It's never been offered in auctions before, so we're extremely, extremely honored.
Yeah, it is really, really stunning. So, could you tell us, what makes a Clyfford Still piece so unique, especially when you compare it to his other peers like Mark Rothko, we know the color field paintings, Jackson Pollock, the drip paintings, Willem de Kooning, his really raw portraits of women.
He's one of the first to crack into abstraction very early on, already in late 40s. He was already in abstraction much earlier than his peers and some of the artists that you mentioned just now. In his late period, 1960s and 70s, he's really mastered the use of this void and emptiness in his canvases. And that kind of resonates really well with Asian abstraction of this like emptiness and mar. I think his late works are very much unique and different from, as you said, some other peer abstract expressionism who are more sort of dynamics with painting the whole canvases. He really uses this empty space very effectively.
So the empty space is untouched.
Yes, so later period, yes. So it's increasing more and more his later period, that the use of the emptiness becomes more sophisticated and refined.
It is so beautiful. And so if one were to come to Sotheby's and be completely blown away by this painting, which they will be, of course, and they wanted to see more works by Clyfford Still, which museums would they have to go to
Denver.
see? Just Denver?
Well, I mean, 95% of his works are in Clyfford Still Museum, which was his huge wish. When he passed, he always wanted his works to be experienced holistically, right? So that museum is built for that purpose, to fulfill the artist's wish. But he also has works in MoMA.
Must be MoMA, Guggenheim.
Yes, all these major
SF
institutions.
museums,
yes,
with great American
all the
collections.
major great American institutions do some extent hold Clyfford Still paintings.
So basically, if you wanted to see more Clyfford Still works, you would have to make a pilgrimage to
Denver.
Clyfford, right?
Yes,
the
because
Still
that's
Museum.
where 95% of his works are. But also at the same time, you could acquire this piece and enjoy such a masterpiece, museum quality piece at home.
Oh, whoever manages to get this piece is
one
such,
lucky collector.
Yeah,
Yes, I'm
very
already
envious.
jealous.
Yeah.
So let me introduce you to some other paintings. We have a lot of very exciting paintings this season, from East and West, Young to Blue Chip. Very exciting season. We're very happy. But I picked this piece because I think you have some association with this piece.
This painting is very familiar. I mean, at least the series, you know, definitely moving away from something abstract to something representational, but equally powerful.
Right.
Yeah, Zhang Fanzhi, and I can see by the date, 94,
exactly.
it's
so this is the seminal year, because it's the first year.
Yeah,
Zhang Fanzhi started this very iconic series, mask series.
Yeah, which basically put him on the map of the Chinese contemporary art world.
Exactly, and the current owner of the piece acquired this particular piece from the show, which was held at
Hana, yes. So I worked there in the mid-1990s, yeah, when we had this show. And I remember Hana Art TZ Gallery was located in the old Bank of China Club, the same building as the China Club, and collectors like David Tang, they saw the series and they snapped up paintings instantly.
Right.
And David even hung one of the mask series in the foyer of the China Club.
Right.
This one painting which uncannily looks like Prince Charles. And,
yes.
And I remember everybody whoever would go up to the China Club, they would almost instantly come down to the 5th floor and ask, you know, who is the artist? Can you tell us more about the mask series? And, you know.
So 1994 was very important for Zhang Fanzhi because he just moved away from rural Wuhan, his original sort of birthplace, to Beijing. And then he started to work on this series. He painted about 24 mask paintings in that year. And for the show that was to be held in Johnson's Gallery in 1995.
Yeah.
And the current owner actually acquired it from that show, and it's just one owner, fresh to the market, in perfect condition. It's such a rarity to find a masterpiece like this.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you know, so many of Zhang Fanzi's early paintings capture the mood of China in the early 1990s, particularly with his hospital series and his meat series. They all explore raw human emotion. But the mask series, of course, it's so much more contained in its energy. How do you see this Zhang Fanzhi continuing this exploration of human emotion?
So this is almost like a self-portrait to me, a young man coming from rural area to hustle bustle of Beijing, which was already rapidly changing. As a city, it's a much bigger city than Wuhan, but also at the time, as you said, China was going through such transition. So he must have been overwhelmed with all these changes and, you know, all this like some sort of Western suit with the mask, reminiscent of the pose that's so famous in Rodin's Thinker.
Yes, I was going to say that, you know, this seated pose.
Yes, this is actually the only composition in the entire 24 paintings.
It's not so, I can't seem to recall any other painting from this series. They generally are all standing.
Right, so this is very interesting in a way that the young man is wearing this mask with a smile, but obviously his composition signifies that the man is composing, sort of contemplating about his thoughts, anxious, overwhelmed, you know, all these sort of mixed emotions that would be associated with this pose is somewhat contradicted with this sort of smiling mask on the face. And I think this is a sort of very important piece, not just for Zhang Fanzhi, but also for Chinese contemporary art, because this period, a lot of artists were experiencing the same sort of rapidly changing society of the values, of the clothing, of the customs, and a lot of things, and it really captures that era perfectly.
Yes. Yeah. And do you know how many paintings he created in 1994, the series?
So Mask is 24 paintings have been created according to the catalog resonance that's recently been published. I think about half of them have ever come up in the market.
Right.
But considering how his market has been booming for so many years, and only half has come up, that really shows, you know, how these people who bought from the show that you are involved with understands the significance and
They've
importance.
just basically hung on to these pieces.
Exactly.
So it's very rare to find
Exactly.
something from 94.
Exactly.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, it's like bringing back all these old memories.
I know,
Yeah.
like it must have been so exciting.
Hello, old friend.
Okay, so let me show you one last painting that we're also excited about from another Asian country, Japan.
Oh yes, another superstar.
Exactly. So this is Yoshitomo Nara's Rock Girl executed in 1998. And his girls have almost become icons of the time.
They are. Actually, on one of the covers of ArtAsiaPacific, we had a very similar little girl on the cover in 2004, and that particular edition sold out immediately, and we continue to get requests for that particular back issue.
Yes.
I mean, there's something really about, I mean, that these kind of young, angry children, it resonates with so many people. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think his kind of discontented youth has, you know, captured the imagination of the public?
That's a very interesting point, because he's obviously a Japanese artist, and a lot of people associate him with ukiyo-es and sort of mangas and cartoons and kawaii movement. But that's, his works kind of have managed to go beyond that. Like as you said, it's captured the universal attention of the collectors and audience, not just the collectors, but like small children around the world look at his works and resonate so well. He portrays this innocent child, sort of born obviously innocent, you know, without any baggage, and witness all these big bad injustices in the world, gets disappointed, angry, sad, sort of. There's this really fine balance that he perfectionates in this simple form girl, that all mixed emotion of what child goes through, and then through their lens, how they see the world. And they're angry, they're sad, but they're like sort of, there's this rebellious feeling about, okay, I'm gonna do something about this, I'm gonna fix this. That's really universal, and that's really timeless. And I think that's one of the reasons why his works appeal and speak to a lot of audience, not just the collectors, but not just the art audience, but also to the general public. We actually have a Hong Kong tram running with this girl's image on. And, you know, even if you're not collecting art, everybody just loves this girl.
Instantly, You know, earlier with Felix, I was talking about how with so many of Picasso's portraits, they were actually self-portraits of the artist himself. And I've met Nara a couple times, and I know that he has this really kind of punk rock attitude. So I wanted to ask you, to what degree do you think these portraits of these angry little children are actually a reflection of Nara himself?
So he was a single child, and both of his parents were working and busy, not paying a lot of attention, or maybe you know, outside of house all the time. So he was sort of lonely. So he's said it a few times, that how lonely his childhood was, and you can kind of see that self-portrait element in these girls, that they're sort of lonely. Like, you don't have other protagonists. It's a single person. It's a single child, and although they're portrayed in girls, as you say, I think we can see the sort of self-portrait element of his youth as a child in his iconic protagonists.
And Nara's having such a big moment right now. He has a major museum show in Taiwan at the Kwandu Museum of Art,
and
in the US.
LACMA,
He has two major shows, one at Dallas Contemporary, and of course the mega blockbuster at LACMA in Los Angeles. What do you think is this kind of, he's been around forever and he has like a kind of cult following. What do you think about this resurgence in kind of museum interest in his work?
It's interesting, because we're beginning to see new collectors, not just within Asia, but out of West, sort of showing interest in Nara pieces. And in recent auction history, for example, we have sold our Naras not just to Asian audience, but to the new collectors in the West. And I think people, as I said, you know, people resonate with what these sort of children, portrayed children, protagonists identify themselves well with what, it's not just sort of Asian thing, it's not just kawaii thing, the emotions expressed in this children are very universal, and people find themselves almost in these protagonists.
Thank you so much, Yuki, for making time out of your really busy schedule, especially just before the preview
Thank
opens.
you. It's my pleasure.
These 3 really rare works that will appear in your evening contemporary sale. Right now, I have to go see Nicolas because you know he has something really exciting to share with us.
Okay.
So thank you, Yuki.
Thank you. See you.
Hi, Nicolas. So what is exciting in Chinese art?
One of the most exciting pieces we have here is an album by Hongren, who was one of the 4 great monk painters of the Qing dynasty. He was someone who was a sort of Ming dynasty loyalist, and so retreated from public life back to his home country of Anhui, and devoted his life to Zen Buddhism. He was a Zen practitioner, and you can see all these ideas sort of expressed in the paintings. And you can see he sort of harked back to the 14th century painter in his style and his brushwork, which is very dry, and in some of the landscapes very sort of geometric. And you can see him harking back to Nitan, for example, here. You can see the sort of the purity of that brushwork, very similar to his, and also in some of the paintings. The style of Fan Quan in the Northern Song, that very monumental style of landscape that went back to the sort of early Northern Song, the great period of glory.
Actually, some of these paintings remind me of just hikes I took recently in Lantau, and it really, really also reminds you of just how timeless Chinese literati landscape paintings are, don't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, these could be, some of these paintings could be very contemporary.
Absolutely, and what you see here aren't actually landscapes that he saw with his own eyes. These are sort of more likely to be landscapes of his mind,
imagined.
Internal landscapes, imagined.
Right.
And it's a real sort of ode to solitude. So you have these trees and these boulders, lonely boulders in a sort of in a landscape devoid of any human beings.
And how would you display this? I mean, this is not one continuous scroll, right?
So this is actually an album. So it would be in a very intimate format. This is something that you would have appreciated in a time of contemplation or with a friend, so a like-minded scholar.
Yeah, they are very contemplative, intimate pieces.
The last thing I'd like to show you is this extraordinary set of Imperial seals that we're offering. Come with me.
So we have 3 Chinese ancient seals. Stylistically, they look so different, but you've grouped them together. Why?
Together, those 3 seals really tell you the story of the rise and the fall of the Ming and Qing dynasties. They are truly exceptional. And the first one we've got here is, in fact, probably the only jade imperial seal surviving from the Ming dynasty. It was carved for Empress Wen, who was the wife of Emperor Yongle. And so that dates to the early 15th century, which is really the apex of the Ming dynasty. Very, very powerful dragon you'll see here.
Wow.
And so it was made for Empress Wen. She was the daughter of the general that helped Prince Zhongshan Shuda, who helped the Hongwu Emperor, the founder of the dynasty, to seize power. And so it was Emperor Hongwu who sort of married the daughter of this general to his own son.
And why is part of it destroyed? It's a fragment.
It is a fragment. You'll see it's just half a seal. And it was destroyed. You can see the scars here. It was destroyed in 1644, 3rd of June, in fact, when Li Zicheng, the rebel peasant, came into the Forbidden City and destroyed all the ancestral seals of the Ming. That's one of the first things he did, in fact. And
so it being partially destroyed, does that make it any less important? Or?
I think in this case, basically, since it is the only one, that is the only one surviving, and in fact, the scars that it carries with it really tells you the story of the dynasty. So you have really rise and fall together in one single piece. Quite
Historical
extraordinary.
scars. Yeah.
Historical scars. And in fact, even the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century, and we're going to look at one of his seals in a second, he was looking at all the archives of the Ming and couldn't find a single seal surviving. And that is when he had this sort of chilling, cautionary tale, where he understood that basically once you lose power, you lose all your objects of power as well. And so, in fact, he wrote a poem in 1782, which is about 120 years after the seal was destroyed, reminding himself of the fragility of power.
Right. So these seals were objects of power.
These are objects of power. These are ancestral objects that were put in the temple of the Ming Dynasty emperors.
I see. And so this seal over here, it's modeled after that particular seal, that Ming seal?
I mean, from that period, basically from that seal specifically, I don't know, but it's based on Ming Dynasty seals. This seal here is the largest and most important seal that was ever carved for Emperor Kangxi. And so he was not quite the founder, but the person who consolidated the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and it probably dates to, the early part of his reign, maybe 1680s, 1690s. What's important about this one is that you have his entire political program written in 4 characters here. It sort of reads Jin Tian Qin Min, which means revere heaven and serve your people, which is the absolute cornerstone of emperorship throughout the Chinese dynasties. It is the key motto of emperorship for all the dynasties, and Emperor Kangxi took that very seriously, his ancestors having just usurped the power from the Ming.
Right, as a principle of how to rule.
It's a principle of how to rule and how do you get power? You get it from heaven, so you have to revere heaven and you have to serve your people. And in fact, serving your people and revering heaven is pretty much the same thing. That is the key sort of message here, and one that his successors took very, very seriously.
Something I noticed on this particular seal behind you is that there's this inscription on the side of the seal. How common is that?
Actually, you see some seals inscribed in the palace. In the marketplace outside the collection of the Palace Museum, it's extremely rare. This particular seal was carved for a hall, the Jiantang, which was a hall that Emperor Qianlong had built on the very spot where he met his grandfather Kangxi. So what is the significance of this seal? This particular seal here, yes.
And that's his grandfather.
That is his grandfather.
Seal.
Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, here on the poem, there is, he makes reference a couple of times to how important it is to serve your people, so that motto sort of echoes down the line. And so you have here on this seal a poem that is dedicated to the grace of his grandfather that says Jiantang, the Hall of Grace Remembrance, because from the moment he met him when he was 12 years old, on this very spot in the Summer Palace, the grandfather and grandson built a very close bond for the year that he had left to live, the Kangxi Emperor. So his grandfather invited him to move to the court, spend time with him, live with him. He instructed him in writing.
Basically grooming him.
He basically groomed him.
Right.
And in fact, what it says here, what's important, it's a seal of legitimacy. It really says that basically my grandfather, it's sort of in sort of veiled terms that his grandfather chose his father to rule so that one day he could be emperor. And in fact, it's a seal that legitimizes the most controversial succession of power, which is that of Emperor Kangxi when he chose his 4th son, not his first son, but his 4th to rule, so that possibly one day Emperor Qianlong could be on the throne. So you got to feel the weight of history in your hand. It is quite exceptional.
Wow. And this jade, it's so unusual. I've never seen a color like this. What kind of jade is it?
It's actually white jade, but what you'll see here are burnt marks.
Oh.
There's a seal that was...
So that's not the natural color of the jade?
That is not the natural color of the jade. It was burnt in 1860 when the British and French armies sacked the Summer Palace in Beijing.
So another kind of
It's
scar of
another
history.
scar of history, and in fact, this is a seal that sort of cautions his children to complacency. He says his children, his grandchildren, when you'll be on the throne, you have to work hard, you have to be diligent, you have to work for your people. And the scars that you have here kind of tell another story.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Nicolas, for taking the time to share your expertise on these really priceless works of art. The history, in particular, with these three seals is so fascinating. I've learned so much about Chinese history. And of course, these pieces are really museum quality, like so many of the other works that you have on offer during your spring sales this season. So
Thank you very much, Elaine.
Thank
I
you,
really
Nicolas.
appreciate us, you taking us around.
yeah, thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of you watching us. And I would like for those of you in Hong Kong, I invite you to come and view these objects in the flesh with your own eyes from tomorrow all the way up until April 21st when we close our exhibitions. The sales, meanwhile, will be taking place at our Sotheby's Gallery on the 5th floor of Pacific Place 1. If you'd like to come, please make a booking to these sales. We'd love to welcome you. For those of you who want to enjoy the live streaming experience, you can follow us on our website, on our social media platforms, and we will be live streaming our icon sale, our modern art evening sale, and our contemporary art evening sales. So tune in for the action. Thank you very much.